Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amita Vide from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and this is a module on the different perspectives on power and empowerment in the paper on community organization. We have so far contextualized and seen that the concept of power is extremely important for critical community practice. But this concept of power is an extremely complex concept, and the concept of empowerment, which perhaps is intimately related to the concept of power, is therefore also an extremely complex kind of concept. There are multiple theories of power, and so there are multiple perspectives on empowerment as well. And this is what basically we are going to learn in this entire module. As I said, power is an essential consideration in the notion of critical practice. This is because power is the dimension which perpetuates oppression, it also sustains oppression and domination, and yet it also has positive facets. So there are multiple ways in which to conceptualize power, and there are multiple ways in which to challenge domination and assert empowerment. So this is something that we need to understand really, how power has been actually theorized. So we will first go through one of the simplest definitions of power given by Robert Dahl. Similarly, one sees a very similar definition which has also been given by Max Weber, and both of them actually see power as the ability to influence behavior. And when we say that influence behavior, one can simply see this as if there are two people A and B, then power is that ability of A to get B to act like what A wishes him or her to be. Okay? Now this likelihood then takes Robert Dahl and Max Weber to look at the different ways in which power actually manifests. And one sees that this can range from influence to, it can range to extremely coercive ways and physical sheerly coercion which can also happen. So there are different bases of power also. So when we look at basis of power, these kind of conventional theorists of power take us to thinking about how powerful groups are powerful by way of possession of resources which may be tangible, but at the same time there are also non-tangible bases of power, and therefore these also is something that one needs to be aware of. Max Weber's notion takes us to the thing that different social groups are contesting for power, because each of these have different interests and strategic interests, and they are involved in some kind of a competition or contestation in order to gain their interests. They will also therefore have differing resource bases, differing bases of power. So the overall view that is presented to us is that power is something which is involved, it's a inescapable part of human relations and societal relations. Okay? So this is one, as I said, one of the most simplistic notions of power. But we now move to also looking at if power is not just direct, but power is also indirect. And these indirect forms of exercise of power perhaps become more and more complex. Just to give an example here, one would see several groups who accept their oppression as normal. Okay? So they do not even see this, that their interests are not being served by a certain kind of thing. To give an example, can one see that the interests of women per se, okay, if we look at gendered interests, a whole lot of actual domination is accepted by women as this is the way that things should be. Not just that, one also sees that it is women who perhaps also perpetuate the kind of oppression which happens vis-a-vis them by a overall patriarchal system. And therefore then, one cannot see power as just who exerts influence over whom and how, but I think it is important to understand this systemic deployment of power. And it is this systemic deployment of power is the one which has really been the concern of community practice. Okay? Now in this context, Mills brings us to a very interesting point, and where he says that power also has a positive function and which involves making decisions. But what Mills points out is that power involves both making decisions, but it also involves not taking decisions. Okay? And this, therefore, by deferring decisions, one is also looking at many different ways in which power is actually manifesting. Now we will also try to looking from these indirect forms of power, we'll try to look at more systemic ways of how power has been understood. Now in these systemic ways of understanding power, one basically sees that at a societal level, power is involved in the creation of structures of authority. It also confers legitimacy upon these structures of authority, but at the same time, power is also involved in challenging these structures of authority. And therefore, at a societal level, one should also look at how bases of power are actually distributed, how they are actually existing in different societies. Okay? For example, they can be physical strength, they can be linked to wealth, they can be linked to ownership of other kind of resources, or there may be less tangible ways of also exercising power. In our own society in India, for example, one can see that India is now becoming a society which is more and more unequal. So where you have a small proportion of people, around 15%, who hold a whole lot of resources within the country, and there is a large mass of people who in fact have no access to productive resources. So this is in terms of tangible ways, but there are also non-tangible ways. For example, one will see that more than 100% perhaps women are involved in labor, but on the other hand, very few women actually have access to or ownership over property. Okay? So you will begin to see that there are multiple ways of envisaging power even at the societal level. This takes us to a very, very interesting theorist on power, which is Foucault. Michel Foucault, who was a French social scientist, basically sees power as relational. Okay? And when we say power is relational, what he basically sees is that power flows through the entire social body. It connects the social body. And there are mutual waves of influence. What this basically means is that each of us is simultaneously powerful and powerless at the same time. So one may be powerful in one context and one may be powerless in another context. To give an example here, you may see a Dalit person perhaps who is employed in a very, very low scale kind of a job in an office, and where he is one of the perhaps most powerless person in that entire context of the formal organization. In his own family context, however, he is extremely powerful in relation to all the family members and especially the women in the family. So one is simultaneously powerful and powerless in differing contexts, and this is something that we need to recognize, and this complexity is what Foucault brings home to us. He also brings home to us the entire aspect that power also has productive dimensions just as it has got repressive dimensions. Now what are these productive dimensions? Productive dimensions is basically that power holds things together, and therefore power sustains an entire social body, and therefore a challenge to it is also something which is highly destabilizing. One should therefore begin to also recognize that power and empowerment cannot be seen as two sides of a coin. They are not complete opposites of each other. They are not binaries, but that there are several continuities between them. There are several overlaps between them as well. This, I think, as one begins to think about the entire body politic and the extremely complex ways in which power is embedded in all of these systems, it brings us to another very interesting notion of power which has been given by Wartenberg. Wartenberg talks about two kinds of power. He talks of power over and power to. Power over is what we have discussed, Dahl's concept, Weber's concept, which always looks at influence of someone over someone. Okay, so this actually talks of the repressive dimension of power. Now, what Wartenberg actually talks about is power also has a intention which is positive, that just as competition, contestation are inescapable parts of human relations, so is collaboration, so is cooperation, and therefore power to, power with become important notions. Now, these notions of power to and power with have also been then taken ahead by several feminist scholars. So if you look at Mary Parker Follett's work, or Emmett's work, or even Arendt's work, all of them actually talk about why are men so obsessed with a repressive notion of power. And perhaps this is because this entire notion of competition, of power over, the race for resources, that resources are scanty, is something which is in some ways built into this entire patriarchal notion of power. As against this, what these feminists, through their different theoretical propositions, actually point out is that it is possible to look at power as integrative, as how it builds relations, how it builds collaborations, and therefore in fact one needs to think of not power as a part of a war, but power as also how together we can empower. So empowerment, according to the feminists, is not a way of that one is reducing somebody else's power. It is not a zero-sum game, but rather one can collectively expand the horizons of power, and this is something which is, I think, a immense contribution of the feminists. Taking this ahead, in fact, Golding proposes a theory of integrative power, which means that basically we can all expand our thing. They also point out, along with Laszlo, who is a peace theorist, that basically adversarial power relations, especially in an age of globalization where all nations are interdependent, one recognizes the interdependence of human beings. In this kind of a day and age, adversarial power relations, a concept of power over, is really becoming anachronistic. On the other hand, there are people like Lukes who say that thinking about this kind of an integrative power is somehow taking away the very, very real aspects of power which are focused on the materiality of power, and it somehow takes power to very, very, fragile, very dubious, undescribable kind of realms which hold no validity in the real world. So this brings us to the material configurations of power. Now, within the material configurations of power, we basically have the Marxist viewpoint, which is very, very critical. What did Marx propose in relation to power? He basically understood that the ownership and control over means of production is one of the key dimensions of power. And it is this basic structure of society which then determines other kinds of superstructures of power. So this creates classes in society, and this structural dimension therefore is a very necessary dimension. Gramsci, who is a revisionist of Marx, what did Gramsci propose? Gramsci proposed that basically this relationship between that Marx had proposed, that structure is what is primary and superstructure is secondary and built upon the structure. Gramsci basically said that this superstructure of ideas, of how structures of class domination are actually maintained through different ideas, is also as much. So it is not secondary, but it is as important as this base structure, which is material. And for this, therefore, what he says, that if there has to be a genuine transformation in society, if there has to be an empowerment, then basically you require organic intellectuals. What are organic intellectuals? Who are they? They are basically people who experience oppression, so they understand the materiality of it, but at the same time they give ideas which can basically challenge the hegemony, or rather the perpetuation of domination which happens through ideas. Just to give an example of this hegemony, in India, in the Indian context, one could look at the role of NGOs itself. Okay? And often it is said that NGOs act as that dimension which basically produces hegemony. Rather than challenging oppression, it creates and keeps the overall structure of production and oppression in society intact, and in fact advances that, and that the interests of the of maintaining the status quo rather than challenging the status quo. So what do you realize from all of this? That basically through all of these discourses of powers, one basically realizes that just as there are adversarial competitive relationships in society, mutually satisfying, cooperative, collaborative relationships are also an integral part of society. So the real challenge really in community practice is identifying who are the exploited, what forms of domination do they actually experience, and as far as possible identifying who are the possible cooperators, who are the possible adversaries, and through what kind of processes is this domination both perpetuated and how it can be challenged. Now within this, one will basically see, and one should also conclude, that power and empowerment are linked, but it is not necessarily opposite of each other, and that is the complexity which Foucault gave to us, which we need to also recognize. I'll now take you to certain perspectives on empowerment itself, and one of the foremost that I would like to discuss in this regard is the entire theory of Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian priest and an activist, wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. There are other books which are also equally inspiring, which he has written. Now, what did he advocate? He advocated basically a process of conscientization. What is conscientization? Conscientization is basically an idea which has two parts. One is reflection and the other is action. And he emphasizes that reflection and action, which together constitute praxis, is something which is essential to critical practice and to the overall historical task of really liberating the oppressed from oppression. Just to kind of take this ahead, why Paulo Freire's thoughts are very important is basically because he talks to us and tells us how the attempts to create revolutions and really challenge oppression have happened in many different parts of the world at many different points in time. But often what has happened is that there is a regime change. The people who were oppressed earlier become the new oppressors, and the cycle of oppression, however, continues undisturbed. Okay? So his entire methodology is really geared towards how does one break this cycle? How does one create a world where there is neither an oppressor nor are there oppressed? And from that point of view, one needs to understand the importance of this reflection and action both going hand in hand. The other important person who is important in the Indian context really from point of view of empowerment is really looking at Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi looked at the power of self in relation to empowerment, and this is another very critical part which is extremely interesting, because what Mahatma Gandhi brings us, I think all of you are aware of the context within which Mahatma Gandhi launched the freedom struggle. He is seeing that there is this nation, a nation of millions, which is actually being dominated by a handful which is coming from a foreign country. Okay? At any point in time, you will not see that the number of British officers who were existing in the country was not more than a few thousand, whereas we were a country of millions. Right? How does one look at domination in this kind of a context, and whether domination is really throwing this foreign rule away, or whether this is more than that? And it is in this context that Gandhiji bring up and thought of these methods of satyagraha. What is satyagraha? Satyagraha is an assertion for the truth. Okay? Where does this truth come from? This truth emerges from the self. So we are talking about a power which is there within us. So which is a very different dimension of power. So far, when we looked at Paulo Freire, he is talking about reflection, action. So reflection, while it may involve an internal process, a lot of it is also a collective thing. But what Gandhiji is bringing forth to us is that power to challenge domination is not out there. It is not lying in weapons. It is not lying in the physical basis of power. Everyone doesn't need to. So the way in which, for example, Marx suggests a class struggle is basically that one needs to challenge the ownership of means of production. Gandhiji doesn't deny that, but he basically adds in a new dimension, which is that this power is there within us and we need to unleash that. In order to unleash that, there are a whole lot of techniques which Gandhiji suggests. So one of this is sadhana suchita. What does sadhana suchita means? Basically he sees that if your aims of empowerment are to be something which is noble, one needs to look at the convergence of the means with the ends. You cannot, if you want to have peace, then the means to achieve peace cannot be violent. Okay? So I think these are very important dimensions. The second dimension which Gandhiji talks about is Swayam Shasan. What does Swayam Shasan mean? Swayam Shasan means self-discipline. And this basically is, if you have to unleash the power of the self, then that self also has to be disciplined and channelized. And then you can move towards satyagraha. Satyagraha is the assertion for the truth. It is not an individual assertion for the truth, but it basically says you begin with yourself and then you also move on to the collective body. In a more modern context, and we go to another perspective on empowerment, which is really brought in by the feminists. Now the feminists basically move with this idea that power relationships are not just everywhere outside, that it is the personal which is political, and this politicization of the personal, in most other contexts, empowerment, challenging power stops in the public domain. Nothing permeates the household level, which is considered to be like a private kind of affair. Okay? And from that point of view, this assertion that the personal is political is an extremely critical kind of assertion. So how does Srilata Patliwala, who is I would say a leading feminist who has worked in several development issues in the country, what she basically says is that empowerment is a process of transforming the power relations, between individuals and social groups. And for this, basically, three aspects of empowerment are very important according to her. One, that the means of access, the actual basis by which power is and domination is created, those need to be changed. For example, if it is ownership over property which is perpetuating the oppression of men over women, then one needs to make a change to that ownership of property itself. So one needs to change those means, whether they are economic resources, natural resources, intellectual resources. The second is by transforming the ideologies that justify inequality. And this is very important, right? Because otherwise one may change those means. A woman may, suddenly you may find that a woman is a sarpanch, or you may find that there is a woman's name on the nameplate of the house, but on the other hand it may still be the man who is driving away the woman when things are not going according to his the way he wants to. Okay? And therefore that ideology that is justifying this kind of inequality also needs to be challenged. And the third thing that she points out is that we need to also transform those structures and those institutions which are basically reinforcing and preserving these power systems. So for example, if there is a landlord and a tribal who is working with this landlord on his land, then we need to also change that institution through which that tribal gets to work on the landlord's land for years together for less than minimum wages. So those institutions also need to be changed. Another important perspective which is very interesting is Naila Kabir's perspective. Naila Kabir from IDS, who basically says that we need to look at different institutions. So these are institutions such as community, the state, the market, and in these institutions she tells us that besides the official policy, there is also an unofficial system of rules, of resources, which is very critical. So she basically suggests that if you have to move on the journey of empowerment, then this unofficial script also needs to be unpacked. And when you begin to unpack that, then you basically begin to challenge some of these systems of systematically perpetuating domination. So what have we realized through these feminist discourses? These feminist discourses tell us that revolution is not a matter of some distant possibility out there when an entire societal thing, but it is a everyday aspect that we can make change at our level through our everyday actions as well as on a collective basis. So what we have together is basically many different perspectives on how can we empower, what are those different dimensions of empowerment. I will end with a bit of a cautionary note, and this cautionary note, which is that empowerment was earlier thought of as an extremely radical concept, but gradually it has entered the development discourse. And within this development discourse, where it first entered through feminist literature, then was incorporated by party literature. If I'll give you one particular contemporary definition of empowerment, which basically says and defines empowerment as expansion of assets and capabilities of poor people to participate in, negotiate with, influence and control the different forces that affect their lives. Now, seen in this fashion, one can actually see that empowerment can be commodified, and that danger really exists in the kind of context which exists today. And therefore, I think what is very necessary really for all community organizers is to see that analysis of power needs to be multidimensional, it needs to be multi-scale, and it needs to be highly situated. And also that these kind of analysis of power cannot be really only academic exercises, that basically they need to be thought of as a pedagogy by which those who are oppressed, those who are dominated, begin to identify what are the forms of domination which they want to contest. They begin to identify who are the oppressors, what are the systems that are oppressing, and begin to undertake actions that gradually expand their individual and collective capacity to challenge these forms of oppression. I would suggest that the entire topic of power and empowerment is an extremely fascinating topic, an extremely complex topic with multiple theories, contesting theories, and therefore please use the text as a prompt to further reading, and several of which have been I have referred to both in the presentation as well as in the text. Thank you.